Om Namah Shivaya. My name is Marin Vayu and welcome to the Five Elements world. In this session, I will talk about the five elements of nature and perhaps we can find the origins from where this concept is coming from. Now, many people heard about the five elements: fire, water, air, earth, and the fifth element, which is mostly called as space, but in my village we also call it the Great Spirit or the life itself. And even though many people heard about this concept, most of the people are surprised when I said that this concept is the most famous philosophical and spiritual concept in the whole world, in the whole history of humanity. And I know that this sounds unbelievable, but it is a pure fact, because we can find this concept as the base of Chinese tradition, Indian tradition, Egypt, Middle East, America, Europe, everywhere. So let me tell you some things that will surprise you. Let's start from the further east, from Japan. In Japan, the concept of the five elements is very known. It is called Godai, and we know that it is coming from India through Buddhism. And even though Japan was influenced also by Chinese traditional knowledge about the five elements, and the Chinese it's a little bit different from Indian, however, Japanese tradition are following the Indian version of the five elements. But we will come to India. First, let's go to China. All the Chinese traditional knowledge is based on the concept of the five elements. However, they have two elements, different names from the rest of the world. They have fire, water, and earth, which is the same everywhere, but then they have metal and wood instead of air and space, which is Indian version, or let's say the rest of the world. And even though the names are different, if you study the characteristics of those elements, you realize that they're talking about the same things. And when I said all the traditional knowledge of China, I mean Feng Shui, I mean I Ching, the whole Chinese medicine. This all is based on the five elements. Feng Shui, for example, is the knowledge about the elements in the space, the energy of those elements in the space. It is a knowledge which they use traditionally when they were constructing houses or temples. It is like some kind of architectural knowledge. But what is interesting is that the literal translation of the Feng Shui, as the name of this esoteric teaching, is air and water. But the Chinese version of the five elements doesn't have air, and that is very strange. And another strange things we can find in I Ching. I Ching is one of the oldest esoteric teachings in China, and it is kind of teachings about predictions, and it is based on the elements of nature. However, originally they had 8 elements, not 5. They have earth, water, fire, wind, which is very interesting, heaven, also very interesting, because these are like the elements of the Indian tradition. But then they also have thunder, which can be another fire, lake, which is another water, and mountain, which is another earth. Anyway, they categorize these 8 elements into 5 Chinese traditional elements. So this is telling us that probably the original 8 elements of I Ching and the 5 elements of the traditional Chinese knowledge are 2 different traditions. This can be a clue that the 5 elements is coming from somewhere else, because we know that I Ching is much older. I Ching must be from China because you don't find the same or similar knowledge in other parts, like in India, for example. But the 5 elements concept could be easily imported from India. And also because we know that many knowledge came to China from India. So let's explore India. In India, all the traditional knowledge, same like China, even more, is based on the concept of the 5 elements. For example, Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a knowledge about the life, of course, but it is very similar to Chinese traditional medicine. So we can say that Ayurveda is an Indian traditional medicine, and it is based on the 5 elements. However, originally Ayurveda seems to have only 3 elements. They call it 3 dosha. And now, today, in the modern time, when you go to study Ayurveda, of course, first thing you will start to learn is about the 5 elements. But I think it was not like this in the past. I think, and I'm not the only one, that the concept of the 5 elements came to Ayurveda much later, and Ayurveda embraced it, same like Yi Jing in China embrace the 5 elements in their own teachings. So after these 2 traditions merged together, then they put these 3 doshas into 5 elements, or 5 elements into 3 doshas. So they said that these 3 doshas are actually made out of those 5 elements, which is kind of strange, because how can you put 5 into 3 or 3 into 5? There is no balance. One very strong clue that Ayurveda in its origins didn't have the concept of the 5 elements but 3 is because they didn't have the knowledge about the system of the chakras. And chakras are connected with the elements of nature. They even represent them. Today you will learn about the chakras if you study Ayurveda. But if you ask an older Ayurvedic doctor, they will confirm that this was not in their own teachings. And the next famous esoteric teaching in India is called Vastu. And Vastu is the same like Feng Shui in China. And Vastu is also like Feng Shui, based on the concept of the 5 elements. It is the knowledge of building temples and houses. It is the knowledge of the elements in space. And then we have Tantra, which has the system of the chakras, which is the knowledge of the elements in human body. There are few different versions or system of chakras. There is 4 system chakra, 5, 7, 8 system chakra, but the most famous one lately is the 7 chakra system, of which 5 of them, the first 5, are directly connected with the 5 elements of nature. But I will talk more about that in the next episode. And then we have yoga, which is one of the most famous today esoteric teachings from India. And yoga also have the system of the chakras from Tantra, but it also has the system of 5 koshas. These koshas are layers or levels of our existence: physical, emotional, energetic, intellectual, and spiritual level. And these are connected or representing the 5 elements of nature. And this is the base. And even one of the most famous yoga guru in India and in the world also say that many times, that 5 elements are the base of yoga.
So the entire yogic system, the basis of yogic system is called Bhuta Shuddhi. That is taking charge of the 5 elements of air, water, earth, fire and space. So these Panchabhutas are 5 elements, taking charge of that is the entire yogic system.
If you have mastery over the elements, you not only have mastery over the body, the mind, over the very creation.
And then we have another very famous esoteric teachings in India that is based on the concept of the elements of nature, and that is Jyotish, which is the Indian astrology. But we also have astrology in the Middle East, so maybe this concept of the 5 elements came from Middle East to India. And one of the clues is Ayurveda with its 3 elements, same like Yi Jing in China with 8 elements. It is actually a theory, a very known theory, that in India there was one culture who came from West and influenced the culture of India. What it seems to me is that Ayurveda belonged to the South India, and the concept of the 5 elements came somewhere from Northwest, perhaps from the Indus Valley. Another clue for that is that in the ancient Vedic script, it is written about gods of nature. And even though the most famous gods today are Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, 3 gods, like 3 doshas of Ayurveda, or like trigunas. However, if you read in the beginning of the script, you will read about so-called devas, and these were the gods of nature, and actually the most important one were the gods of the five elements. Surya and Chandra, sun and moon, and then Indra, Vayu, Varuna, Agni, Prithvi, the gods of the five elements. They were very present in the earliest text, but later they start to slowly disappear. Now if you go to India, there is almost no temple for those gods that they call devas. Another fact how the five elements are based of all the ancient esoteric teachings from India is that they have rituals. The most famous one, it's called puja, and puja actually consists in performing rituals with the five elements, because obviously rituals were designed to connect with gods of nature, gods of the five elements. Even though many Hindu are not aware that the elements on their altar are representing the elements of nature. So if this knowledge of the five elements came from West, from where that could be? Perhaps Middle East, or let's say Sumerian, because this is one of the ancient culture that we know. We don't know which one is the oldest. The Vedic culture in the Indus Valley, or Sumerian, or Egyptian, or Chinese, but definitely Sumerian culture is one of the oldest. There is not much that we know about this culture, but we know that they had the gods of the elements of nature. So maybe astrology is their knowledge, or it came from somewhere also to them. Because we know that astrology was known in the Middle East, in Babylon, for example. And also in that time, numerology was one of the biggest esoteric teachings. And guess what? If you learn about the characteristics of numbers, because that is numerology, when you give characteristics to numbers, then you realize that these characteristics are also the same like the characteristics of the five elements of nature. And then we have Jewish tradition, which is also coming from somewhere there, and they have their own esoteric teachings called Kabbalah, which also has to do with numerology. But guess what? Their God, it's called Yahweh, and it's written with 4 letters that, according to some Kabbalah books, those 4 letters are representing the 4 elements of nature. And why not? If Indian gods were the gods of nature, if Sumerian gods were the gods of the 5 elements of nature, then why not a Jewish god represent the elements of nature? And talking about Jewish, there is one guy who became very famous. His name was Jesus, because he was born as Jewish, right? And actually, there is a book that I came across accidentally that is the book of the community called Essene, and Essenes were the spiritual community from that time, from the time of Jesus. And the book is called The Gospel of Peace by Essenes, in which they wrote that Jesus himself was teaching about the elements of nature. He called them angel of fire, angel of air, angel of earth, angel of water, angel of heaven, I believe so. Of course, this book is very controversial, but it is a fact that in that time this group exists, the Essenes, who were dressing themselves in white, like the John of Baptist who baptized Jesus, and they were using rituals with the elements. For example, baptizing is their own ritual with water that John used to baptize Jesus. So historically, we don't know where Jesus learned all his teachings. Some people believe there are books that says that he learned that in India. Other people believe he was in Egypt. And some people believe that he learned from those Essenes. Because in Egypt, we also have many gods, of which Osiris, Isis, Set, Nubis are the most famous. But these were not real gods. These were semi-gods. These were children of the gods, perhaps kings who became gods. The real gods were the 5 main gods, and these were the gods of the 5 elements of nature: Ra, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, at least according to one tradition in Egypt. And the esoteric knowledge from Egypt it's called alchemy, which is also based on the concept of the 5 elements. And even though they mostly talk about the 4 elements, same like in astrology, only because the 5th element was kept a secret because they were using it when they were trying to create gold. So remember this, they kept the knowledge of the elements, especially the 5th element, secretly. And this is the information that you can find in some of the most famous alchemy books. Anyway, this leads us to Greece, because in Greece, even though a lot of knowledge the Greek philosophers import from Babylon and from Egypt, because many of them been there, a Greek culture is often believed to be like the cradle of the Western culture. And guess what? The first philosophers of ancient Greece also were talking about, thinking about, discussing about the 5 elements of nature. The first philosophers were trying to understand which of the elements is the primordial one from which all the others emerge. Thales, the first one, thought that it was water. Anaximenes thought it was air. Anaximander thought that it was a 5th element. He didn't call it like that. He thought that it's not even an element. He called it aperion, something that is infinite. And then we have Pythagoras, who was also learning in Egypt and Babylon, and unfortunately he had a lot of knowledge kept secret because he established a kind of secret society, which is today believed to be the base, the cradle of all the secret societies in the world. And guess what? They almost all of them are using rituals with the 5 elements, and they have teachings about the 5 elements. So maybe even Pythagoras was teaching about the 5 elements, but he kept this secretly, like in alchemy. But definitely what we know is that he was teaching about numerology. And then finally we have Empedocles, the Greek philosopher, who is known that he presented to the world the concept of the 4 elements. So he said these all 4 are primordial elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And then he influenced the famous Greek philosopher Hippocrates, who created the concept of the 4 temperaments, which is based on this concept of the 4 elements from Empedocles. And these 4 temperaments are actually the characteristics of the elements in human behavior. And this concept of the 4 temperaments was used in psychology for thousands of years in the Western world until just few hundred years ago. And then finally we have the most famous Greek philosopher Aristotle, who introduced to the world the concept of the 5 elements, because he added the 5th element into this story of the 4 elements. But I don't believe that the 5th element was his invention. I think that he got this idea from Anaximander, who was talking about aperion, something that it's not an element. But the question is from where Anaximander got this idea. Anyway, many researchers believe that the concept of the 5 elements came from this guy Aristotle, because his disciple was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquered half of the world. He went all the way to India and to Egypt. So researchers believe that he spread the knowledge of the 5 elements to the world. It is a possibility, but I don't believe in that, because I believe mythology is much older than Alexander the Great. And in all those places they had a mythology, they had the gods of the 5 elements of nature. And then in Europe we have the Christian church that supported the idea of the 5 elements, especially because of Aristotle, but maybe also because they knew about the Jesus, I don't know. However, later they dismissed this theory. But before Christians in Europe, there were shamans, shamanic tradition, like we call them pagans, and they all have the knowledge of the elements of nature, and they were using it in their rituals and other kind of knowledge. There is one tradition still today, it's called Wicca, and they use the concept of the 5 elements as a base of their teachings. And not just European, but also shamans from all over the world, also Mayans from America, they all use the concept of the 4 or 5 elements in their teachings about directions, like in Vastu and Feng Shui. They had calendars according to the 5 elements, and they perform rituals according to that. Sometimes a ritual for only one element, like for example jumping across the fire or walking on the fire or praying to the fire or baptizing with water or swimming in the water or covering themselves with mud or in earth or with ashes. But sometimes they also include all the elements in the ritual, like in India in famous ritual puja, or we have the same or similar, very similar ritual in Catholic Church that the priests are performing before the Mass. So literally this concept of the five elements is the most famous philosophical and spiritual concept in the whole history, in the whole world. Some researchers believe that this concept of the five elements was not from one source, but that mystics around the world came to the same or similar conclusion by observing nature, because the elements are the same everywhere. But some other researchers, including me, believing in one source of that knowledge, and to me this sounds much more sense, because we actually have many clues that not every mystics, not everyone, not every culture came to this concept of the five elements, but they have 3 elements, they have 8 elements and some other things. But once they meet with the concept of the 5 elements as a theory, they embrace it. They merge with this concept. Why? Because it is so beautiful, so logical, so simple that it's resonating with everyone. This is why everybody embraced this concept in their own teachings. It is the concept of balance, and I will talk about that in another episode. And then you will understand why is this 5 elements so popular. Because it has a great wisdom behind, a wisdom of nature. So I believe that this concept is coming from one source, because I spent 15 years in researching this topic about the 5 elements in different traditions, and I found some missing links and some incredible explanations that are pointing not only to one source of that knowledge, but also something very controversial. They pointing to the conclusion that this source, this original concept of the 5 elements, was actually created by some advanced civilization. Because these origins that I will present you in another episode, it's very beautiful created. It seems like somebody did it with a long history of connection with the elements of nature. And I don't know from where is this advanced civilization. It can be in China, can be in India, can be in Sumeria, in Egypt, or it can be even Atlantis. And I actually do believe that it is more likely that it is from Atlantis. Because I also researched this topic for many years, and I also discovered some incredible things, which I will also talk in the next episode. But I will finish this session with this painting again, because this painting is the most famous philosophical painting in the world. It is in the museum in Vatican City in Italy, and it is on the wall. It is a part of the bigger painting, and this is in the center. This is Plato and Aristotle, the 2 most famous Greek philosophers. And if this guy presented to the world the concept of the 5 elements, at least he did to the Western world, but this guy presented to the world the concept of the story of Atlantis. That is an interesting coincidence. So that's it for today. I see you in another session. Om Namah Shivaya.